Hi, this is Tattoo Tony playing my theme song. Enjoy. Hi, this is Tattoo Tony. I'm with my family in Ely, Minnesota at the Dorothy Molter Museum. She's known as the Root Beer Lady. Right now, I apologize, I don't know much backstory on it. Hopefully we'll go into the museum and find out more. I do not believe she's alive still, and as far as I know, I believe she was somebody who's known for making her own root beer. Here I am at the Root Beer Lady Museum, and I noticed when I pulled up in the parking lot, they've got some really old snowmobiles. I think these are pretty cool, and I would love to have one, especially operating. Let's see what this says. It says Johnson Ski Horse. I assume that's the same company that made Johnson outboard motors. And there's another snowmobile. Pretty cool. The one thing I do know is on a snowmobile, you need to be careful not to run into a barbed wire fence in the field. Somebody, I believe that was one of my dad's students, he was a teacher in high school, ran into a barbed wire fence probably doing 60 and was pretty much decapitated. So interesting fact, don't run into barbed wire on a snowmobile. Okay.
Also for Friday, I believe that I can shop. Oh, yes. Across from the Granddaddy Lodge. So what is that? What would there be for us to sit there? They do have very limited, but there is a fellow that knows quite a bit about the whole mining of the mining shaft. Yeah. And what they're trying to do there. We're right here in Ely. To get to Knife Lake, you would travel about 25 miles to Moose Lake by vehicle, and then from Moose Lake you would paddle about another 15 miles all the way up to Knife Lake. That's where Dorothy was. Now, have you been in the area before?
No, ma'am.
Okay, well, like I said, we're right here, and if you want to do a nice little hike, there is the Cushway Falls hike. You would go back to the highway and go to the right about 3 to 4 miles. You'll go past Witten and over the Garden Lake Bridge. You'll see a Cushway Falls sign, and the parking lot is right across from the Deer Ridge Resort. Okay. And it's less than a half-mile hike down to Fall Lake. Nice viewing of the waterfall and some really big yellow birch back in there. Oh. So it's a nice little hike.
My mom told me we should come here.
Okay, well, I'm glad she did. We have a paddle fence here similar to what Dorothy had on the Isle of Pines. These paddles are to help support the museum with a paddle membership. You can have your name, business, organization put on a paddle. But what started out as a way of Dorothy cleaning up her shoreline of broken paddles, she'd use that wood for the fence. Soon canoeists started breaking their paddles. They all wanted to be part of her fence. And then on the next visit up, they'd come up with a nice painted paddle and give those to Dorothy. And we do have all of those in the Point Cabin. No, I grew up in Ely. We always referred to the area as a bug-infested wasteland, nothing but rock. You can't grow anything here. And that's what Dorothy found on the Isle of Pine. But she would travel Knife Lake. She'd find black dirt. She'd haul it back to the island. And she'd have flowers growing in her old boats. And so we have volunteers that plant flowers in our boats here.
Who's this gentleman?
That is a statue of Dorothy.
Oh, okay, gentlemen. I'm terrible.
She was not a very big woman, only about 5'4". Oh, wow. But when you see the video and the pictures, you'll see she had very large hands. Sort of like the episode of Seinfeld with the lady with the man hands. Yeah, that was Dorothy. We have a pathway here similar to Dorothy's pathway to the outhouse with the signs hurry, 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 and hurry, hurry, hurry. That's cute. And then the outhouse is a mock outhouse, and it has a sign, now you can take your time. This was her brother Bud's doing. He liked to paint signs. And quit your bellyache, and that's a term Dorothy said quite often when the nieces and nephews didn't want to do chores. And so her brother made that sign as well. The small cabin beyond the outhouse is the Katie cabin. We have Bob Carey's office memorabilia in there. He was the author of the Ripper Lady book. He passed away several years ago. And we have his desk, his typewriter, his art supplies, even his 1972 presidential campaign sign saying, "Vote for Jack Pine Bob" on the fisherman's ticket. So you can take a walk down the path and look in on the back window and see his office. This is the winter cabin. You can see how all the logs were dismantled. Each and every one was marked and stamped, so everything got put back together in the proper order. All the work was done by volunteers. So this is the original cabin. Yep. There's a seat right here. Talk a little more. Now, my husband and I both knew Dorothy. We used to snowmobile up to Knife Lake for a day of ice fishing. On our way back home, we would stop at Knife Lake, at Dorothy's, and warm up, have a cup of coffee. And when you walked in the door, it was just this narrow little path to the kitchen. There was so much junk and clutter out here. There were beds on each side and cabinets. All of her wood supply would be out here, and she'd keep her cold food supply would stay frozen out here in the wintertime. And I can remember seeing ice cream on her windowsill. Dorothy loved ice cream, and the snowmobilers would bring that up to her. But Dorothy's story starts in Arnold, Pennsylvania. She was born in 1907. She was the third oldest of 6 children. Her mom was Mattie, her dad was John. They called him Cap. He was a police captain for the Baltimore, Ohio Railroad. He was gone quite a bit of the time. When Dorothy was only 7 years old, her mother passed away. Cap wasn't able to take care of 6 children. He ended up putting them all in an orphanage. And that kept them all together, and he would be able to visit them when he got off the railroad. They remained there for 5 years, and then Cap remarried. They gathered up the children, and they moved to Chicago. Dorothy entered the schools in Chicago. She was a pretty good student, but more of a tomboy. She liked her sports, volleyball, swimming, tennis. She also excelled in rifle shooting, and this is a target from a citywide championship that she took. And little did she know that that would become a pretty good talent to take up into the North Woods. She would be able to do her own hunting. After high school, Dorothy decided to go to nursing school, and it was at this time her dad was up here fishing on Basswood Lake. He heard about the Isle of Pines where you could catch these big 30-pound lake trout, so he made a reservation for the following year. Dorothy was on a break from nursing school, so she was able to join him on that first trip, and she just fell in love with the area. The following year, 1931, Dorothy graduates from nursing school. It's the height of the Depression. There aren't any jobs to be had, so once again, Dorothy returns to Knife Lake with her family. Now, Bill Berglund, he was the original owner of the Isle of Pines. He had bought the 3 islands from the logging company back in the early 1920s after everything had been logged off up here. And he's the one that started the fishing camp. On the large island, he had the winter cabin, the hunter-trapper cabin, the point cabin for guests on the point. All 3 islands were connected with bridges. You could walk from island to island. The smallest island had the little Katie cabin on it, and it was like a little honeymoon cottage. You can have the entire island to yourself. And then the summer island had a canvas wall tent. And it was cooler and breezier there. Dorothy would stay there in the summer, and this is where it was easier to get her water off the dock, and that's eventually where she would make all of her root beer. Now, Bill Berglund was 30 years older than Dorothy. He was already a diabetic with a care of Bill as his health deteriorated. Fortunately, the brother and the sister knew Bill's wishes, and they took her to the Two Harbor Courthouse, had everything legally changed to her name, so she did become the sole owner. One of the main means of getting supplies from Ely all the way up to Knife Lake all this time had been the float planes. The planes would bring up all the food supply, lumber, stovepipe, gasoline, kerosene, propane, cases and cases of pop. Even the guests were flown up to Knife Lake. That all came to an end in 1949 when President Truman signed an executive order that would ban planes over the entire boundary waters. It was mainly pushed by environmental groups who didn't like the fact that fishermen were getting way too deep into the wilderness. They tended to overfish the lakes rather than have better rules and regulations on the fishing. They put this blanket ban on the airplanes over the entire area. So it was quite devastating to all the fly-in fishing camps all along the Canadian border, and quite devastating to Dorothy as well. For a couple of years, she didn't even have any pop on the island. She wasn't about to carry cases of pop over 5 portages. That's quite a bit of work. But she soon realized that all the planes, when they brought up their pop all those years, never brought the empty bottles back into town. So that's when she decided to make her own root beer. And we have some of her equipment here: the crocks, ladles, funnels, bottles, caps, cappers, the wash tubs, the Coca-Cola cooler where they keep the root beer cold. And with the help of her brothers and sisters, nieces and nephews, she's making 10 to 12,000 bottles of root beer every summer. People were drinking 2 to 3, 4 bottles of this stuff, not because it tasted so good. Sometimes there's pretty nasty stuff depending on who did the measuring and who did the mixing, if you got all the ingredients in there right. Her recipe was pretty simple: Knife Lake water, sugar, yeast, and Schilling's root beer extract. Now, if her dad helped, he'd use his paddle and stir that crock, and then set the paddle on the floor, on the ground. Then he'd stir again a little bit, so you maybe got a little bit of sand in there, a little bit of pine needle, but it was always ice cold, and that stuff would sink to the bottom. So, I mean, it didn't matter. It could have been ice cold mud water. People would have been just as happy to have something ice cold after a long day of paddling. So Dorothy becomes known as the Root Beer Lady. In the mid-1950s, you have the development of snowmobiles, and as clubs started forming all across northern Minnesota, they said, you know, we could help Dorothy and bring up her supplies in the wintertime. So they started having a designated Dorothy Molter Day every February. Dorothy would give a long list of her supplies to the clubs. They'd gather it all up, and then they'd just converge on Knife Lake from all directions, from Ely, Winton, Babbitt, Tower, Two Harbors, Grand Marais. Dorothy would be waiting on the shore with a big pot of venison stew. Many of those snowmobilers stayed the entire day. They chopped her wood, they cut her ice, they fixed up things on her cabins. And this is what they did all through the 60s, 70s, and the 80s, as long as snowmobiles were allowed in the Boundary Waters. They became known as Dorothy's Angels. They provided so much help. Well, in 1956, you have a piece of legislation that's trying to get passed through Congress to establish the Wilderness Preservation System to protect areas of our country from being overdeveloped. The problem, it was having a hard time getting passed, largely due to the fact that they included all of the Boundary Waters. The problem there was they had 400 property owners with homes, cabins, resorts, outfitters all along the Canadian border. And these people didn't want to sell their land to the government to have it revert back to wilderness. In fact, when the government first went to Dorothy, they said, Dorothy, you have 3 islands, 3,000 feet of shoreline, we'll give you $1 a foot. Dorothy says, you're kidding, $3,000 for my 3 islands? I don't think so. And she sent them away. They also went to Benny Ambrose over on Otter Track Lake. He met the Forest Service at his door with a shotgun. He said, you come back, this is what you're going to get. Now, Dorothy and Benny were just 2 of many who refused to sell their land to the government. And they keep coming back, offering more money, and they keep refusing. Well, it took from 1956 to 1964 to get that Wilderness Act passed, and that was with the help of our Senator Hubert Humphrey. He included wording in that legislation that would allow the continued use of motorboats, snowmobiles, and logging of the area, and that made it a little bit easier for people to consider selling their land to the government. But Dorothy and many others still refused. In 1965, Dorothy's 3 islands and anybody else who refused to sell their property was condemned. They ended up in the court system to determine how much money they would get, and in Dorothy's case it was $27,000 now. And they told her she could stay till 1975. And once Dorothy accepted that offer, the Forest Service said, oh, Dorothy, we forgot to tell you, this is a wilderness. There's no commerce in wilderness. You can't rent your cabins or your boats, your canoes. You can't sell your root beer. That was her only income. Her friend said, Dorothy, they never said anything about donations. So she said, oh, coffee cans, pickle jars, mason jars, put the word donations on it. She ended up collecting more money by donations than had she been selling or renting her stuff. And it was a nice way of getting back at the government. There's no taxes on donations. So 1975, the government goes back up to Knife Lake. They're expecting Dorothy to be this broken-spirited woman ready to leave the wilderness. And here's Dorothy doing quite well. She doesn't want to leave, and they didn't want to start that argument all over again. So at this time, they said, okay, Dorothy, you and Benny are the last 2 people in the Boundary Waters. We'll give you life tenancy, but you'll have to be outpost rangers for us, be our eyes and ears. Let us know if there's any needs on the portages, the campsites, any injuries or fires. And they were given two-way radios to report such things. And Dorothy and Benny were perfectly fine with that. They just want to live out the remaining years up there. Well, in 1978, a second piece of legislation further restricted the area. It added another 50,000 acres to the area. It banned logging. All the sawmills around here went belly up. It eliminated many more of the lakes that allowed motors on them. We're now restricted to 16 of the 1,100 lakes that we can still have a 25-horse motor on them. Snowmobiles were gradually phased out by the end of 1983. So once again, Dorothy's way of getting her supplies up to the island had been blocked off. Fortunately, her relationship with the Forest Service had greatly improved over the years, and they said, don't worry about Dorothy, we'll bring up her supplies, we'll even fly her in and out. So that was good. Benny Ambrose died in 1981. He had built a really nice home for his wife and his two daughters up on Otter Track Lake, but they weren't quite as outdoorsy as Dorothy, or as Benny, and so the wife left him, took the two girls, and they lived elsewhere. After Benny's death, the Forest Service went up, tore everything down, and burned it to the ground. They said all signs of man had to be removed from the wilderness. Dorothy continued living on the Isle of Pines for a few years, calling into the Forest Service, let them know she was okay. Mid-December 1986, she failed to call. It wasn't all that unusual. She's 79 years old. And she'd forget once in a while, but always remember in a day or two to call in. And the Forest Service said, it's Friday, let's just wait till Monday. If we don't hear from Dorothy on Monday, we'll send up a plane. When Monday came, there was no call from Dorothy, so they sent up the plane. As it circled the island, it didn't see any smoke coming out of her chimney, didn't see any fresh tracks out in the snow, so they were pretty well prepared when they landed. And they found Dorothy on the floor of the cabin. She died of a massive heart attack. Now, when the news of Dorothy's death spreads all across northern Minnesota, we're greatly saddened. Many of her dear friends begged the Forest Service, please let us have one last snowmobile ride to Knife Lake to pay our respects. Snowmobiles had been banned for 3 years already, but surprisingly, the Forest Service said yes. Now, at this time, my husband had lost his job at Reserve Mining Company in Babbitt. It had gone bankrupt, and he took a job in southern Minnesota. When I called and said we're going to be able to go up for this ride for Dorothy, he said, I'm coming home. And I said, well, great, but we've got a bit of a problem. We only have one snowmobile. I'm not missing this ride. So as he drove up from the cities, I took the truck and met him in Tower at the Articat dealer, and I bought a second-hand machine. The next day, we gathered on the shore of Knife Lake with close to 1,000 people. We were all gathered in the bay in front of the winter cabin. There was a yellow caution ribbon around the bay to keep everybody corralled together. We had permission to be in the boundary waters with our snowmobiles, 2 Dorothys, but no further. There was a priest on the shore with a megaphone, and he eulogized Dorothy. It was a really nice service, but as you stood there, you could feel and hear that ice creaking and cracking with the weight of all those people. And I remember telling my husband, if we all go down, they've got yellow ribbon, they'll be able to find us, but we were perfectly fine. After the service, we were offered coffee and donuts on the shore, and then we were able to go through Dorothy's cabins one last time. At the end of the day, friends of Dorothy's asked the Forest Service now what happens, and again they said we tear everything down and burn it. They said you can't do that. This is Dorothy. She was the last resident of the Boundary Waters, a big part of its history as well as our local history. Let us take out whatever we can. The Forest Service said, okay, fine, but you only have till spring breakup. So from January 87 to about April, volunteers went up, dismantled the cabin, packed up her belongings, started pulling everything all out with dog sleds. But as the spring thaw turned all of the snow on the lake to slush, it got harder for those dogs to pull the heavy loads. So once again, the Forest Service lifted the ban on snowmobiles, even allowed ATVs to assist. Everything came down the 7 lakes, 5 portages, was put in storage for a few years. And then ground was first broke over by the chamber office building, the log building on the corner of Highway 1. But when the winter cabin was reconstructed there, everybody in town said Dorothy would never have her cabin in that wide open space with the busy cars going by. So that's when the foundation asked if we could move everything here to these plantings of red pines. These trees were planted in the early 1950s as a memorial to our World War II veterans. And it provides a beautiful setting for Dorothy's Islands, similar to what she had on the islands on Knife Lake. And we opened the museum doors in 1991. Any questions?
Yeah, I do. It's kind of unrelated, but are those just old snowmobiles out front on the side?
Those were some of hers as well.
Those were some of her snowmobiles?
Yep, her or her brother's. And
okay.
They were pretty much in disrepair, so they've just been left there to just sort of
Okay,
be
one
there.
more question. The one is a Johnson, Is that the same company that makes outboards?
Possibly, I'm not positive.
What
on
is
that.
the red brand?
There was a Mercury.
Okay.
It could have been a Mercury, because I remember there used to be Mercury and Snow Jets and Arctic Cat Polaris, Yamaha, Skidoos.
Mm-hmm.
John Deere had a snowmobile.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, back in the day, there were probably at least a dozen or more, and now it's down to the top, what, 4 makers: Polaris, Arctic Cat, Yamaha, and Skidoo, Bombardier. So
Aside from this stuff in here, was any of this stuff original, hers?
this is
You
all
got it?
hers.
Oh, okay, the pictures and everything?
Mhm.
That's
Well, the photographs on the
tables.
wall are what we have taken over the years
Oh,
of
okay,
her.
of her.
But I mean, anything that's not her, I mean, I think the one picture of Dorothy when she's looking like she's got a cigar in her mouth and a rifle,
Mm-hmm.
that's sort of a reenactment that somebody had taken, and it was
Okay.
probably hers then.
Okay.
But, yeah, the snowshoes are hers, the wooden shoes, she was of German-Dutch descent.
Clogs, huh?
Yeah. We'll go on into the kitchen, you'll see
Okay.
the photograph that we had of Dorothy. We did match up the walls, so it looked pretty much like this, you know, when we took everything. Now, all of this stuff here is just a fraction of what Dorothy had. She had so much clutter, and once things got hauled up to Knife Lake, it stayed there. But many of her relatives did take mementos. A lot of things just plain and simply had to be thrown out.
Sure.
Do we get to sign the guest book?
Yes, that was the first thing that Dorothy would have you do, and we continue to ask people to sign their names as well. We're just as nosy as Dorothy. We like to know where you come from, and it's fun to see the different states. We have the two-way radio here. She would call into the Forest Service, let them know she was okay. If you sat here and you had a cup of coffee or that ice-cold root beer, you'd maybe take a dollar bill and just stick it around the windowsill like this. This is why Dorothy made out so well with her donations. This was at a time you could go downtown for a nickel or a dime, maybe a quarter tops, and get a cup of coffee or a bottle of pop, and here she's getting $1. So it was pretty profitable for her. She was an avid reader. She enjoyed reading about the wilderness, wildlife, plants, animals, flowers. But after a busy summer with close to 5,000 canoeists on the island, Dorothy really looked forward to the fall when it wasn't quite so busy, and that's when her sister Ruth would come up with the last motorboat. As the ice formed on the lake, nobody else could get up there. Dorothy and Ruth would actually have quiet time, and that's when they'd make all kinds of crafts like the sequin calendars here, the Christmas ornaments with the beads and the sequins. They'd make hundreds of those and give them as gifts to friends and relatives. Always have them out on a tree at Christmas time. And she had found the Fabergé type eggs in the department stores in Chicago, and she thought those were so beautiful, but they were very expensive, so she found kits and she made her own. She'd heat the cabin with the wood stove, always have a big pot of coffee brewing. You'd always smell it as soon as you hit the island, it was so strong. She did have a gas stove that was easier to control. Back in the days, the airplanes would bring up her propane tanks, and then the snowmobilers did, and toward the end it was the Forest Service that would bring up her propane. She even had a gas refrigerator, and that helped make her life quite a bit easier as well. The 2 bedrooms, we've got the dividing wall opened up, so you can see her log bed, her flannel pajamas, her backpack, some of her winter boots. Another thing that Dorothy and Ruth made were these little pine cone dolls with the wolf fur for the hats and the mittens, back in the days when you could hunt and trap the wolves. Now, Dorothy loved birds. She had bird pictures, paintings, posters, needlepoint. In fact, she would write Christmas letters, but they were always in the third person. Louie the loon, or Baldy the eagle, or Ruby the hummingbird, and they would tell what Dorothy did through the summer, and she would send those out to guests and family members. In 1952, Dorothy had an article written about her in the Saturday Evening Post, 1952, saying she was the loneliest woman in America. She laughed. She said, "I've got 5,000 canoeists come by my island. I am not lonesome." Here she is with her beautiful flowers that she grew on the island. She had to prove that she could do that. And you can see she has a nice fresh haircut. She was not a hermit or a recluse. She'd come into town for haircuts, dentist appointments, doctor's appointments. In fact, in the early years, she did go back to Chicago. She'd work for in the hospitals there, relieve the regular nurses so they'd have time off with their families. and then Dorothy would make money and return to Knife Lake after the first of the year. Nice pictures of Dorothy's youth all the way through the years on the Isle of Pines. Here she is in that nurse's uniform. The picture on the top with her backpack, she's 60 years old in that picture. What she would do is she'd take her square stern canoe and a motor, have a second canoe in tow, come down the 7 lakes and the 5 portages, get to Moose Lake, hitch a ride to town, get her supplies, get back to Moose Lake, fill those canoes, and head back up. And she'd maybe run into Boy Scouts or campers on those portages. They'd see this white-haired lady, figure she must need some help. So they'd offer, but when they'd see Dorothy pick up a pack and put it on her back, pick up a second pack, put it on her chest, pick up her canoe and her little motor and start trotting off, their jaws just dropped. They couldn't believe she could do that much. But Dorothy knew that when you have 5 portages, you carry all you can carry without killing yourself, so you're not going back and forth so many times. On the side wall, the top picture is a picture of Julia Roberts, the actress in the yellow. She was on a canoe trip with her cousin out of Camp Birchwood, and she had a chance to meet Dorothy and have one of those root beers. We just hope she had a good batch and not a bad batch.
Who was that? Julia Roberts?
Julia
over
Roberts, yep.
She's on the far left. Did you ever drink any of her root beer?
Not up there on the island, but after she came down, there were some, and it was pretty well fermented because it was still capped, you know. And when you have yeast in it, it starts making alcohol. So yeah,
That's not too
pretty
bad, is it?
interesting. No, but
Have you seen that root beer they have now? I haven't tried it. Have you seen that? They make this beer now that tastes like root beer. I haven't had it though.
oh yeah, not your dad's root beer.
Yeah.
Yep,
Oh,
yep.
okay.
I have tried that. It's pretty good.
Is it?
Yeah. Now, many of the guests, as well as Dorothy and her family, they would write comments on birch bark and leave those at the Isle of Pines, and we have them all under glass
Oh,
here.
neat.
The booklet on the corner is full of communications between Dorothy and the Forest Service with offers, refusals, and then the condemnation papers. Out back, we do have many of Dorothy's boats and canoes from the islands. Back in the early days, the planes would fly up guests, and then the guests would use her boats, motors, canoes. They'd get gasoline, and she had like a little makeshift store on the summer island where you could get all those things and then pay by donation. And she'd have candy bars, root beer, maybe toothpaste and toothbrush at home, maybe things you forgot to bring, she'd have available. Dorothy would move from the winter cabin to the summer island, from the winter island to the summer island, from early spring to late fall. She'd stay in that canvas wall tent, and that freed this cabin up for more guests. She had the couple beds in the porch area and then the 2 bedrooms here, as well as the point cabin having a couple beds in the porch area and the bedrooms. You know, so she made the most bang out of her, you know, of her sleeping space, and that meant more donations going into her donation cans. So over here we have more of her belongings in the point cabin. Some of her motors for her boats. Rhinestones behind the wall. The ring toss game above the door is similar to the one that we made over by the picnic area. Boy Scouts had left that one on the island. Now, after the '78 legislation, advertising of the area was more geared for canoes, and it went worldwide, saying, you know, go to the Boundary Waters, stop on Knife Lake at Dorothy Molter's, have a nice cold root beer. Well, canoeists from all over the world then would leave these souvenir paddles, and they would put where they came from: England, France, Germany, Japan, Italy, plus
Venezuela.
yeah, Yugoslavia, you know, Brazil, you name it. They came from all over. It got so busy on the island that she actually had to limit visits to 20 minutes. She said she had a hard time getting time to take a bath. She'd get her water all warmed in its tub, and people were at the door. So it must have been pretty intrusive those last few years with that many people coming. She did at one time use a gas washing machine, but campers complained that it was too loud, so it was back to the ringer washer and scrub boards. The panels are full of pictures and writings about Dorothy and her time on in the Boundary Waters. Yep, those are all the original panels that were on her fences. Dorothy didn't paint many, but most were brought up already nicely painted. This is probably the first picture of them when they first went up to Knife Lake. And I just get a kick out of them all in their Sunday best with the suit and ties and hats and dresses and their purses and such. It didn't take Dorothy too long to figure out the right apparel here. A small little Johnson used for her square stern canoe. And then this is a 1957 Polaris
We used to
snowmobile.
have the
Quite the monster size
winch.
machine there.
and two could pull the ice up.
Size now?
We used to cut it in such
Some of them are
big
getting
chunks.
almost as long, but they're not quite as so rustic looking. They have a lot more comfort and suspension, that's for sure.
We
The
just
snowsuit was
put
given
about
to her in
200
'68 by the Bag
pieces of
Club.
ice.
It does have the elite
We
weekly
covered
pack
it up.
on it. We were the first
Either
organized club in the
off
entire
or
country,
or-
and I'm the secretary of the Elite Igloos today.
And that
We
piece
have some great snowmobile trails outside of the boundary
from melting
waters.
so fast.
Some of our ice cutting equipment, the reciprocating saw, the tong for pulling the ice out of the lake. They'd make about 200 blocks like this, fill her ice house, cover it with sawdust and moss, and then Dorothy would just chop off a piece in the summer, wash it off and have it for drinks or for keeping
To
food
catch fish,
cold.
you gotta keep them cold.
And the paddle over here, or the propeller here, this is from an airplane. Back in those early days, Bill Berglund did have a dog named Nibs, but he didn't like when the planes came to the dock. So he jumped at the plane, and the plane prop got a chunk out of it and also a chunk out of the dog. But Dorothy, according to Bob Carey, was such a good nurse, she stitched him up, and he never barked at another plane after that, so. The video is 15 minutes long. The first clip, when it starts again, is Dorothy at about 76. She splits a log for the camera just to let you know she can still do that. But she surprises herself and says, oops, kind of unexpected. She didn't think she could have such a strong wall-up. And then the very last clip is of her dock with a parking meter on it. And of course, her brother had to make a sign that said no coins, just dollar bills. So, yeah. So read through the panels, look at all the pictures, some really great ones, and then the video too, it shows everything from making her root beer, cutting her ice, getting her water. And look at the size of those hands, even here, sort of like the man hands, you know? Yeah.
Let me ask you a question real quick.
Yeah,
Is that saw, you may have said it and I missed it, but is that saw for cutting ice?
that was a reciprocating saw.
Oh, reciprocating saw.
Yeah,
4 inches.
Okay,
they use those as well as the chainsaws, but this was better, you didn't wreck your chainsaw. Because
okay.
they just went back and forth.
So I have
For
some
ice,
of these
right?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll give you 20 bucks for it.
No, I don't think so.
I know. It's really cool though. I'd love to have that. That is cool.
So, if you have more questions, come on back into the gift shop. They said that root beer is always a good batch now. It's made in Janesville, Wisconsin at Gray's Brewery. Just a light, mild root beer flavor and a light carbonation. So it's not as fizzy as most, Cokes and Pepsis and stuff. So it's similar to Dorothy's. We can't make it like Dorothy. We're not gonna use knife.
Kind of unexpected.
You guys missed it. She chopped the log. She just chopped that big giant log in half with an axe. Watch this. See if she does it. Oh. Part of it's her knowing how to hit it in the grain. But that's not that easy, really.
For 55 years, Dorothy Molter has lived in the boundary waters between Minnesota and Canada. For much of that time, she has lived alone. Travel to her island involves 5 portages over land. She lives 15 miles from the nearest road. Despite the distance, about 6,000 canoeists sign her guest book each summer and drink her homemade root beer. Dorothy is a registered nurse who took over the Isle of Pines fishing resort in 1948 when Bill Berglund, the former owner, died.
probably wasn't allowed to have a resort anymore. Lisa, when they turned it into...
She operated the resort commercially until the United
Federal
States
lands
Forest
or whatever.
Service bought her land in 1964.
Hmm?
Her home is now part of
Oh,
the
for
Boundary
fishing?
Water Canoe Area within the Superior National
fishing?
Forest.
I don't know about for fishing.
That's what I mean. I thought maybe she wasn't allowed to have a resort.
She said people came and stayed up till, nearly till she died. She had beds on the front porch.
Right, but remember how they said she couldn't do commercial stuff? It'd be donations, so I doubt you could operate a fishing resort. Because the guy that had it before owned a resort. Hey, that's the stove and the thing we saw in the other
I
room,
come up
isn't
here
it?
in 1930 for the first time with my dad, my mother, my uncle, and an old fellow that worked for my dad. And of course, this kind of country was all new to me, coming from the city and never going out to picnics or nothing. I'd never in a canoe till I come up here. And then I was listening to the guys talking about some of their different experiences. But then they started talking about cutting ice, putting up ice. And of course, we used some of their ice in the summertime, but we had no idea how they got it up here. So they said they make it. So make it in the wintertime.
Okay, here we are on the way to the outhouse. Hurry, hurry. Hurry, hurry, hurry. Now, take your time. Here's a handle, it's an antler. Let's see. Nope, you can't open it. Bob Carey's office. Who's Bob Carey? Okay, let's take a peek. Inside Bob Carey's office. I probably missed it on the tour. I'm not sure who Bob Carey is. 1287 Giants Ridge. Maybe that's a photograph of Bob Carey. I don't know. Oh, National Headquarters. Jack Pine Bob for President. The Fisherman Party. Well, she talked about him in the tour, but honestly I can't remember. Hopefully. Okay, this is a ring toss game similar to Dorothy Molter's they said they put up, and we're going to try it. Are you ready? Can you see me?
Yeah.
No. There.
Well, you need to see the board too. I can see it all. Can I go again?
Oh,
Whoa.
he won.
Pointed at him. How many did I get? 8 and 13.
Hun,
Hang on.
21.
Look.
can I go?
21.